Last night was awfully weird. I was in my childhood home, but at my current age. As I opened the door to my grandmother's room, it suddenly swung back and forth while my hands were still holding it from the side, not the doorknob, and it pulled me forcefully into the room and onto the floor. I felt a cold sweat coming on, but suddenly realized that I had to toughen up and shake it off. I screamed something like, "This is my house! You have no right to scare me! How dare you!" over and over again. I came close to the door and would hear a faint, high-pitched, distorted, tee-hee kind of laugh. Then I woke up. I thought it was already around 6 a.m. because that's usually the time when my alarm goes off. As I grabbed my phone, I was surprised to see that the time was actually 3:07 a.m. I already felt partially awake, as anyone who wakes up at 6 a.m. would. Now I have to force myself back to sleep or I'll feel awful in the morning. I play some ambient sleep sounds from Alexa while I observe the room, anxiously expecting something out of the ordinary, but nothing happened. I fell back asleep, and in my next dream, I was at a hospital with a group of people that I don't know, but somewhere we were grouped together. There's about 5 or 6 of us in a room, with a dead person in the bed, covered with a sheet. As I left the room, I saw 2 more of the people in our group suddenly appear in a different room, somewhat helping each other put another dead body into a hospital bed while the family weeps. I went back to see the rest of the group in the original room, trying to position the dead body to sit up. The dead guy is of mixed Chinese descent, a bit overweight, and bald. Then some information came into my head that he used to own a restaurant or a bar. As they move his torso upwards, they failed, and the dead body dropped onto the floor. This is when things start to get really weird, because the dead guy woke up like he was startled from his sleep. He stood up and started chasing us, accusing us of killing him. His bowels were a mess, and I could see a stab wound on his belly and on his lower back. I ran away in a long corridor and found myself in the nurse's changing room. It had open cubicles like the ones from football players' dressing rooms, with scrubs and casual clothes alike hanging on the wall. I was partially covered in the dead guy's bodily fluids, so I washed up. Then a nurse found me. I looked terrified of what happened, so I explained the situation to her and led her to that room. The nurse came in and started to comfort the dead guy. He began to calm down and sat beside the nurse, then closed his eyes. The nurse looked at me, and without talking, some information came into my mind. I learned that he was a hopeless case, so they just let him lie down until he dies, as he was already in the process of dying when we startled him. After that moment, I woke up, and this time it was truly 6 a.m., 6:30-ish already. I didn't feel any dread as you would in a nightmare. I did a bit of research on dream meanings, but I felt that it didn't fit with me. Then I found out the significance of 3:07 a.m. from the movie The Conjuring, so I thought the exact time was just a coincidence, since it's just a movie. I could not remember the last time I woke up in the middle of the night. It would be very, very rare that it's not worth remembering. But waking up at 3 a.m. with 2 weird dreams will definitely stay with me forever. I want to start by saying that I'm no stranger to odd dreams. I have experienced sleep paralysis many a time throughout my life. I had a dream shadow stalker for years, and I used to have a haunted bed frame that gave me some of the worst night terrors I've ever had. I have shaman blood on my dad's side, and I myself have been studying various aspects of the occult and paranormal for over a decade. But those stories are for another post, I'm just used to this sort of thing. I wanted to express that. That leads me here. Not sure if anyone's felt this as well, but I have been a ball of anxiety lately. Obviously related to the uncertainty in the world and all, yet I still shouldn't feel it this much. The dreams I've been experiencing have been extremely strange. Like I said, I have vivid, lifelike dreams constantly, but typically they're broken up. I have been having Inception-style dreams for the past 2 months every time I go to sleep. Like I'll dream of actually waking up and going about my day, but then I actually wake up. It's so disorientating. Last night, I had a very weird dream. The strangest of them all. I can't recall what I was doing, but I remember distinctly being in a dark, dusty room. The only part I truly know is that there was some kind of box or container with a lid in front of me. Everything was in first person. It felt so real. I lifted the box, and laying in it were 2 dead gray mice. They were stiff and curled towards each other, like a heart almost. That's all I can remember. I only remembered specifically because my significant other said something about a mouse this morning. I did some investigation and read that this could mean a period of financial instability, but was curious to see if anyone else had any ideas. I'm a corrections officer at a county jail in northwest Alabama. I work a 12-hour night shift from 1800 to 0600, 6 p.m. through 6 a.m. Most nights are calm and not much happens from 2200 through 0500, 10 p.m. through 5 a.m. And other nights, you're moving non-stop and police officers are constantly bringing people in. You have a lot of DUIs and junkies on the weekends, and then anything from an FTA to the occasional murder throughout the regular work week. Anyways, like I said, most nights are calm, meaning that hours feel like days, and sometimes a single shift can make you feel like you've been here for weeks. But sometimes, those calm nights are not really all that calm. We have 2 holding cells in the front of the jail used to house inmates that have been recently booked in, and are waiting to see the nurse for screening before going to Gen Pop. We have another room up front that we call the pink room, due to the walls and ceiling being painted a hot pink color because a former sheriff thought hot pink was a calming color. Everyone hates this room. It's our drunk tank, equipped with a camera for observation and a flushable drain in the floor for any liquids that might come out of someone, if you know what I mean. One night after lights out, when everyone was asleep, I heard a loud bang in one of the holding cells, like someone was hitting or kicking the door, which would have been a normal noise if anyone would have been inside one of them. But my partner and I had moved everyone out of the 2 holding cells just a few hours ago, and no one else had come in that night. I thought it might have been the guy we were keeping in the pink room for medical observation, but when I looked over at the monitor for the camera in there, he was sound asleep on his mat on the floor. I went over to the doors of the holding cells to investigate. I lifted the heavy curtains on the windows so that I could see into each one. But there was no sign of anything. I figured I was just hearing stuff since that noise is so commonly heard at all times of the day or night. I went back over to my desk and sat down. It was about 02:45 when I heard that noise, and it was completely silent until about 03:05. I started hearing the noise it makes when a door is unlocked from the control room. From the control room, you can unlock or open any door in the facility except for like 3 that you need an actual key for. There's a door right behind the desk that I sit at that leads to the kitchen and rec yard. That was the door that sounded like it was unlocked. I radioed my partner, who was in the control room, and asked if she had unlocked this door. She said that she hadn't touched the computer since I asked her to let me outside to vape like 2 hours ago. Again, I thought it was a common noise to be heard, the silence is playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, except this time it sounded like the front door. I looked over at the monitors for the front door and saw nothing, but on the monitor for the pink room I could see the screen start to get fuzzy, like static. Then it was completely black for a few seconds. When the camera came back on, the inmate was sleeping in the exact same spot. But everything he had in there with him, his cup, shoes, blankets, was all scattered across the whole room. I would have heard him moving and throwing things, but it was completely quiet for those few seconds when the camera was black. After that, I decided I didn't want to be alone anymore. I went to sit with my partner and started telling her what was going on. After I told her about the doors unlocking and locking and about the guy's stuff in the pink room, she just laughed and said, "Must have been Christine." My partner has been working here for 5 years now. She told me that Christine was an inmate that had died in the old jail next door, and that the reason she haunts this jail is because the buildings are connected. She told me about numerous things that have happened while she was on shift, including actual sightings of the ghost she calls Christine. She said that Christine has gray hair down to her shoulders, and that she's wearing a nightgown. She also said that Christine can be seen walking down hallways on the cameras, inside the cells with her hands on the bars looking through them, and that sometimes you can see her face from the windows outside. When I was a kid, I used to go to summer camp every year. It was one of the things I really looked forward to, since I loved camping. One year, I had a particularly weird experience that was one of those situations which was both scary and in some ways kind of funny when looked back upon years later. When I was 14, I was assigned to a cabin with several other boys, like in other years. A couple I knew from past years, a few I didn't. One particular boy was a guy named Wade. He was kind of off, in an almost but not quite nerdy way, like the kind of guy who liked to play sports but also liked D&D and would fire off random trivia. He was there with his fraternal twin brother, but because of some snafu on the part of the camp, they had been assigned to different cabins, even though siblings who were close in age were normally assigned to the same cabin, barring a specific request otherwise. We had bunk beds in the cabins, and each chose our bed early on. As fate would have it, I got the bottom bunk, and Wade wound up on the top. That night, when it came time for bed, we all turned in. I had a bit of trouble falling asleep, still being a bit wound up from getting to be at camp again. About 20 minutes or so after we'd all gotten into bed, the unmistakable sounds of a guy masturbating started coming from the bunk above me. Now, at that age I masturbated too, so I wasn't one to hold it against anyone else for doing the same thing, but Wade was, well, not really going to town, but he was making no effort to keep quiet about what he was doing. He went on for several minutes before rather obviously reaching his, climax, after which things got quiet again and I soon fell asleep. The next morning, after we were all up and making our beds, I noticed that Wade was the only one not around, so I made an admittedly crude joke to the other guys about how he'd really been having fun the previous night. The others all looked at me in confusion, and one asked what I meant. I commented once again about how Wade had been quote-unquote pleasuring himself rather loudly after we were all in bed, making a gesture of masturbating. Everyone still looked puzzled, and I said, "Surely at least one of you must have heard Wade getting his rocks off." After a moment, one of the other boys said that at the last minute, another camper in Wade's brother's cabin had canceled, and since a spot was thus available in that cabin, Wade had moved over there the previous afternoon. He'd never even slept in our cabin. Baffled, I looked up at the top bunk to see just the bare mattress, and glancing down to where Wade had dropped his stuff the previous morning, I noticed that his stuff was gone. I was now as confused as everyone else had been a few moments before. If Wade had never been up there, then who had been masturbating above me the night before? The other boys laughed and accused me of dreaming the whole thing, but when I later mentioned it to one of the counselors there, he grew quiet for a few moments before saying that there had been a story going around the camp for many years of a teenage boy who had drowned, and whose bed had been the one above mine. As the story went, his ghost supposedly haunted that cabin, but the counselor, like many other people, had always dismissed it as nothing more than a story told around the campfire. Until now. Granted, I don't know that I hadn't actually fallen asleep and just dreamed the whole thing, just like my cabin mates had accused me of doing. I know it sounds absurd. Whoever heard of a masturbating teenage ghost? But it seemed so real, I'm sure that I was wide awake when it happened. My family on my dad's side have many stories of witches. I don't know if this will sound real to you, but my family has always told these stories. My uncles, dad, and grandpa all have a story related to a witch encounter. Some of my aunts as well, and grandma. I believe them, and am here to share their stories. My dad's family come from a small ranch in Mexico. The ranch is really huge, so huge that basically all of my family lives there. Usually if you live there, you're related, but there's probably only 4 or 5 other families that aren't related to us. Once my uncles were getting ready for a party. They were young at the time, maybe early 20s. The party they were going to was at another ranch. My uncles used to party a lot. Sometimes they would come back very late. Actually, that was usually the case. They got ready and started heading out. It was very dark, but they didn't care. They got to the party and one of my uncles, Steve, saw these 2 girls away in the corner. He saw them and said that they were very beautiful. They had light-colored hair and light skin. Being in Mexico, it was really rare to see a girl like that. Steve then elbowed my other uncle, Andrew. They then walked up to the 2 girls and started dancing. After a few dances, they headed home. They said bye to the girls and took off on their horses. They had been riding for about 30 minutes when they saw the same 2 blonde girls walking down the dirt road. They stopped, dismounted, and walked over to them. They were just wanting to see if they needed a ride home. My uncle then heard one of them laugh, and in front of his eyes, they disappeared into the darkness. They both got back on their horses and continued. They later came across another laughing sound. My Uncle Steve got off of his horse and asked who was there. Yeah, it seems stupid now, but my uncle really didn't care about getting hurt. Steve then saw 2 birds. He said they were really big and as dark as the night sky, and they were laughing at him. Andrew got off of his horse and walked towards Steve at this point. Both of them looked at the laughing birds, confused. Then one of them spoke and said, "We enjoyed dancing with you boys." My uncle really didn't enjoy the fact that he had danced with a witch, so he took out his gun and started shooting at the birds. They just flew around and laughed at him more. Then he started swearing at them. They didn't appreciate it, so one of them flew down and clawed at my uncle's face. He only got a little scratch, so thankfully he was okay. The birds took off, thanking Steve for the dance still and saying his name. My uncle had never given any of the girls his name. The 2 of them grabbed their horses and went back home. That never stopped my uncles from going to parties. The scariest night of my entire life was a close encounter with a, later confirmed, murderer when I was camping with my boyfriend in the mountains. It ended with us running for our lives down the mountain in the pitch black, clutching knives and a hammer for self-protection. It was at the end of 2018, our first getaway together as a couple. We went to the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. We were naive. We thought it would be more romantic to camp out as far off the beaten track as possible. We walked really far into the wilderness and got to a spot where nobody passed us all afternoon. We were making s'mores over the campfire after it had just got dark. It was around twilight. All of a sudden, my boyfriend, who has 20/20 vision, saw a man approaching us slowly. He was creeping up. At first, we thought it was a park ranger coming to tell us to put out our campfire. I began to hide the weed, thinking that this was our biggest concern. My boyfriend called out to him, "Hey, can I help you?" We thought it was weird that he didn't have any kind of light on him. He didn't have any camping bag. Nothing for camping. Why was he out here so far with no gear at night and no light? He sped up after my boyfriend called out and came right at him. He had this strange look in his eyes. Absent, blank, off. He didn't answer my boyfriend, just kept walking right toward him. Red flags were going off at this point. When my boyfriend realized it wasn't a park ranger, he quickly put his hand in his pocket where he had concealed a knife. He made it clear that he had a weapon. It was only after my boyfriend did this that the guy acknowledged us. He muttered something like, "Oh, I was just wondering if y'all were having a party." Remember, we're miles away from a single soul. And it was beginning to get dark when he began to approach us slowly without a flashlight. He had no camping gear once again, just a tiny drawstring bag on his back. After he asked what we were doing, we didn't give him any response, but instead asked him what was going on. Again, he didn't answer. He just looked past my boyfriend towards the site. It was windy, so we had put up a tarp to shield ourselves. This also meant that the guy approaching couldn't see how many people were actually at our site, so he actually asked how many people were there, and began to circle our site to check us out. He asked again if we had any other people with us, and again my boyfriend didn't answer him. He carried on circling around. Now bear in mind, we had set up our camp on this crazy steep hill. It was the only spot for miles that was possible to put a camp. However, he told us that he was going to set up camp nearby. He proceeded to walk off in a direction straight up the hill. We knew for a fact he couldn't put a campsite there because of the terrain. Remember, he had no light and no bag with no camp gear. Nothing. We were silent. We listened to his footsteps on the leaves as he walked up the hill in this direction, completely off the path. He kept going for about 30 seconds, and then his footsteps stopped completely. He just went still. Totally silent. We knew he was still there, but we couldn't see him, and by this time it was dark. I started freaking out. I didn't want to seem like a pussy in front of my boyfriend. We had to talk about whether or not we needed to leave. My boyfriend handed me a knife and said that if anything were to happen to him, I should run. When he said that, I knew that it wasn't just me freaking out unnecessarily. He said we needed to get out of there, and to just grab essential items. I was terrified that he was about to shoot us dead. Later on, when I told my boyfriend this, he said no. This was the type of guy who'd probably prefer to stab his victims to death. We began to walk/run down the trail in the pitch black with our lights off for at least a mile. My boyfriend looked back to see him staring at one point. He ran behind me to protect me. This experience has stayed with me. I still can't think of a rational or non-menacing reason why that guy was there that night. I've tried. Now again, this was at the end of 2018, but my boyfriend, now husband, and I were remembering it last night. I decided to type into Google if there had been any murders in the same place around the same time. There were. A few months after our incident on the same trail, an unhinged man with crazy eyes approached some hikers at twilight as it was getting dark. He behaved in a deranged and aggressive manner before stabbing a man to death with a 17-inch knife. A woman that was with him ran for her life down the trail. Finally, she raised her hands in surrender and he began to stab her. Somehow, she managed to get away. The killer carried on wandering the trail and shouted out to other campers to give him a flashlight. They didn't, thank goodness. All of those details were the same ones as the guy who approached us. Same age, same deranged eyes, same lack of flashlight, same time, twilight, same look, same place. The more articles I read, the more I realized this psychopath had been roaming the trails harassing hikers for a while. A few different people had reported him, not just us. Apparently, this erratic and violent psychopath was well known to law enforcement along the Appalachian Trail. His name is James Sovereign Jordan. We got lucky. It could have been us. Last week, at the end of a long shift at a historic hotel, I saw a glimpse of a petite woman with a blonde bob and long beige coat staring up at a wall. It resembled a former manager who had worked there pre-COVID shutdown, but after a second I remembered that she wasn't back to work yet. When I realized this and looked back to where she was, no one was there. My coworker and I quickly scoured the area, but it was vacant. I wrote it off as a benign spirit, as I've experienced some friendly activity there over the years. She just seemed curious or lost. However, I was talking with this former manager on the phone a couple days later, and she told me that she'd just had a dream that she was back working at the hotel and described exactly where she was in the dream. It was the precise location where I had seen the figure. Now, I'm not sure what I believe. I bought a replica of Ivan the Terrible and his son, an old piece of macabre art from Russia back in the day, and hung it up on my wall in a huge portrait behind me yesterday. It's a rumor or popular belief that the painting is cursed, and I've always been a fan of strange items and collectibles, so that's why I bought it. As I went to sleep last night, I was stricken with nightmares. Terrible nightmares. I dreamt I was in a camper with a friend and we sat down to watch a movie called Pendulum. It was a knockoff of Hellraiser. We began watching it and the computer screen just shut off, and we couldn't get it to turn back on, so we had a collective fuck it moment, and I exited the camper to go back inside to the house, whilst my dream friend stayed in the camper. As I came back out, still during the dream night, with a drink, I noticed blood splattered on the windows and rushed inside. My friend had been beaten to death, and Pendulum was pulling himself through the computer screen. After this, I woke up, and by that I mean I came to a real-world setting where I was asleep on my couch last night. I attempted to get up and get some water, as I was thirsting after such a nightmare. I made it to the kitchen, cracked it open, and let it hit my lips, and then suddenly, I was on the couch again. In my mind at that moment, I considered that I had actually woken up. I sat up and walked into the kitchen again, cracked open that same water, when suddenly the refrigerator opened beside me, and I knew I was dreaming then. I woke up on the couch again, real as day, except it wasn't as I went to drink that water again and woke up on the couch again. After this is where it really started to get frightening. I considered that I was stuck in a loop, except this time I went to get up for water and walked past that area with the painting and noticed that it was gone. This let me know I was still dreaming and that I had another false awakening. I woke up for the water once more and started across the living room when I looked to an open doorway that I hang colorful beads from, and in the dark room veiled by the hanging threads was Pendulum. That woke me again. This time I ran to the window and looked out to see cops rushing down my small street to the neighbor's house. My neighbor shot and killed her husband in the front yard 2 weeks ago, and that woke me up again. After waking up a few more times for water, I tried to go outside after another loop, except when I opened the front door, it was pitch black. Then car lights turned on and sped toward me. As I was about to get smacked with someone's F-150, I woke up again. At this point, I stopped trying to go anywhere and just kept trying over and over and over to slap myself truly awake. After looping for another 30 times or so, I eventually actually woke up and was relieved. I got that fucking water and downed it in one go. So this actually happened at the beginning of June, and after some meetings with the cops, I've decided to share it here. It's been a small tradition for me to go quote-unquote camping in my backyard every summer for a few weeks or so. Our yard is 6 acres, and part of it is a small wooded area next to our pond. You can't see the road directly, but you can see the cars passing by if you look well enough. Anyways, since it was a nice area, I set up a small 2-person tent, and the first few nights went really well. A few mosquito bites here and there, but apart from the bugs at the pond, there was nothing too bad. It was the 6th night when it happened. That night I wanted to stay up late and make a small fire in the fire pit to roast marshmallows and all that, simply because I could. I did it all, and now it was 2 a.m. I was walking back to the hill to get up to the wooded area when I looked out over the pond and saw a figure just standing there. I couldn't tell if it was actually looking at me or not, and honestly thought that it was just one of our small pine trees next to the road. Looking around, there was a car parked on the side of the road, turned off. The moonlight helped me see the car's silhouette. At first, I shrugged it off a bit, trying to think rationally about it, because I wanted to go to bed. I called out. No answer. I turned to my side and decided it was all too scary for me and wanted to sleep inside tonight. But then I saw the figure start to move as well. I put 2 and 2 together and then ran towards my house and right into it and locked the back door. It was left unlocked in case I needed to go in. This person was just halfway across the backyard when I locked the door. They were hella fast to get around that pond so quickly. I ran and woke up my parents. My dad got his loaded handgun that he kept in the small safe on his nightstand. I called the police, and my mom went to check on my other siblings upstairs. My dad went out to look for the man, and I stayed on the porch, watching him go off into the yard. By that point, I couldn't see the man, or see far enough to know if the car was still there or not. My dad was shouting a lot, and I couldn't see him very well when he got to the edge of the forest. He was coming back when I saw the car's headlights turn on, and it skidded away with squealing tires. When the cops arrived, he was long gone, and the most description that I could give was a man about 6 foot tall and fast. The next week went by with some investigations around our property, and quite frankly, with lack of description or evidence, much more than some tire tracks, I'm assuming they haven't found anyone. They said they would call me if they did, but at this point, I really don't think they will. My dad is now thinking of putting up some fence along the back road, and I've been staying inside most of the time. So, creepy man in our backyard, let's not meet again. This event happened to me last summer. It was probably the scariest story from my life, and I wanted to share it so hopefully someone learns from it. Something I've realized growing up, year by year, is that this world can be an amazing place, but it is filled with some super sick people. And unfortunately, I've seen that side of our world firsthand. I'm a very social person and love the opportunity to hang out with friends whenever I get the chance. I'm also the type of person who's always looking for the next big thing. I guess I should tell you that I was an 18-year-old male at the time of this story and have a decent-sized friend group both of boys and girls. Throughout high school, we had done a lot of crazy shit together. Being just out of high school, we wanted to do something insane before departing for college. We all decided to go camping in the middle of nowhere for 3 days. Fun, right? And by some miracle, all of our parents thought that it would be fine. So we had 6 people along. Me, my girlfriend Stephanie, my friend Brandon and his girlfriend Kaylee, and Steve and his girlfriend Sarah. We had decided to have 3 different tents for each couple, for reasons that you could probably guess. Being a former Boy Scout, I was aware of everything that we needed to survive for those 3 days. Food, water, and other essential supplies. Being rebellious teenagers, we also stocked up on plenty of booze and weed for our fun getaway. So mid-July we depart for our camping vacation. After hours of driving and driving down back roads, we eventually find a place that looks secluded enough, but not too sketchy like some horror stories. There were houses nearby, but not that close. Again, we weren't looking for a sketchy wooded area, but unfortunately there was no cell phone service. It took us at least an hour to get everything set up. While the girls and Steve finished with everything, Brandon and I took a look around the camp while fetching firewood. We eventually came across a cool-looking trail. We weren't very concerned because there was a house within a mile radius and we assumed that it was those people that used this trail to hunt, which was big in that area, or that animals used it. If you're wondering about our car, we drove a Honda Pilot, which was Steve's, that had plenty of room for us and our supplies. We parked the car rather close to the site, so we had our eyes on it at all times. The first night, nothing much happened. We rolled a blunt, drank a little bit, and called it an evening. The next day we decided to explore the woods a little bit, but Brandon and Kaylee decided to stay behind to watch the site and spend more time together. We decided to go down the path that we had found. Around 20 minutes down the path, Steve spots a metal fence. We approach it to find a cemetery. The cemetery looked old, but there were signs of activity. And no, not some voodoo or cult shit or anything like that, like flowers and notes that people left behind. And beyond the cemetery, we saw a bigger trail that had tire tracks and a half-assed parking lot for the cemetery. We ventured down the path a bit more to spot some deer and then head back because it was getting late. That night we really partied hard because we were about to leave the next day and didn't want to return with extra beer or weed. Now this night was the polar opposite of the other night. The other night was peaceful and we assumed the same about this night as we began to turn in. But boy, were we wrong. You would assume that there would have been warning signs earlier in our trip, like a rusty knife on the path or foot tracks around our site, but no, not at all. All of us woke to a blood-curdling scream coming from Steve and Sarah's tent. as we hear the fabric being ripped by what we assumed to be something sharp. I guess Steve hit the guy really hard with his flashlight and was able to get both himself and Sarah to his car. Now here's the issue. Steve's tent is closest to the car while the other two tents are closer to the trail. So to get to Steve's car, we had to get past whatever attacked Steve and Sarah. Luckily, all our drunken selves were gone because before getting into his car, he yelled cemetery and it clicked in my head. The trail on the other side. So I quickly grab Brendan, Kaylee, and Stephanie and start running toward the trail. I use my phone flashlight to help see. You might think, why would you turn your flashlight on? Well, last thing I wanted to do was miss the cemetery and be lost in the woods with the guy who attacked Steve. By the time we get to the trail, Steve and Sarah had noped the fuck out of there and we could hear the guy chasing us, but from several yards behind. We were able to find the cemetery rather easily, and I hop over the fence first. When we all get over the fence, we notice that Steve had not arrived yet, so we all hid. Luckily, to our advantage, it was pitch black by the time I turned my flashlight off, and we all hid in complete silence. My heart dropped when I heard the metallic shaking as if someone were climbing over the fence behind us. The guy had tracked us down, probably due to the fact that Steve had yelled cemetery. We all stayed as still as we possibly could as we heard the ground crunch as the guy took slow steps. When in fight or flight moments, you're capable of a lot more than you would think, and your brain is put on some super high alert mode. As the guy approached, I realized I had my small Swiss Army pocket knife in my pocket. As the guy's steps grew closer, when he was right on top of me, I grabbed the knife and lodged it into the back of his knee. The guy tumbled to the ground with a shriek of pain and a metallic sound as he dropped his weapon. Soon the pair of headlights came around the corner. Steve had made it. We all got up and ran toward the car. As I stood, the light gave me a glimpse of the guy. He was tall, bulky, and had a look of pure hatred in his eyes as he clutched the back of his knee. By his side laid a huge machete. I was the last one to get in the car, and even before I fully closed the door, Steve had floored it out of there. The girls were bawling their eyes out. We drove to the first house, where we politely knocked and asked for directions to a motel or something. It was a friendly old couple. They told us there wasn't one for miles. They took us in and gave us warm food and a place to rest for the remainder of the night. In the morning, the man brought us his hunting rifle with which to retrieve our stuff from our campsite. When we got there, there was nothing stolen, but all of our tents were slashed apart. The elderly woman called and made a report while we were gone, and when we got back, the officers were at their home, and we gave our statements. They said there wasn't enough evidence to find the guy, but they promised to search. We headed home later that day. No one said a word on the way back. We were all processing what had just happened. The police unfortunately never found the guy. College split us up a bit, but we barely talk about it as a group, and it's been a year. My advice to all of you is please find a populated place to camp. Be in reach of help and the police. Stay safe, please. I was around 12 when I had gotten a babysitting job with a family across town. The family was new to the area and just recently bought the house next to my best friend's place. My first day over was to get familiar with the kids and the house. The parents stayed and evaluated me and of course answered any questions that I had. I spent my time playing and keeping the children occupied. It was a boy named Devin, age 4, and a girl named Cameron, age 7, so I had my work cut out for me. Cameron wanted me to go to her room so she could show me her toys. I followed her up the 2 flights of stairs, but as we came to the top of the stairs, I felt strangely lightheaded, and the hair on my arms rose up. I had an intense feeling of being watched, like there was someone else up there with us. I tried to ignore the sensation and continue with my duties of finding Cameron's favorite doll so that we could go back downstairs. At the end of the day, it was decided that I was a good match, and I was to come back on Saturday morning. As I headed home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I got from that upstairs. I told myself, it's nothing, and I brushed it off to just being in a new place and unfamiliar surroundings. That Saturday morning, I showed up to a busy home as the parents tried to get out the door and show me the last-minute things that I needed for the day ahead. The kids were up in their PJs eating breakfast and already talking to me about all the fun things they wanted to do. After the parents left, I ushered the kids off to get changed. As I was cleaning up the breakfast dishes, I heard a loud bang come from the dining room. I ran back into the room and found one of the false ceiling tiles had fallen from its place. Puzzled, I tried to put it back, but it was not an easy task. After some struggling, I managed to fit it back in, and thought to myself, how could that have fallen out on its own? The day went on, and now it's close to lunchtime. The kids are watching TV, and I'm in the kitchen making something for lunch when I heard another loud bang coming from the dining area again. I look, and sure enough, the same tile was on the floor. This time I left it for the parents to see when they got home. Maybe they can fix it, I thought. Now the kids wanted to play hide and seek. We started off with Cameron seeking, and myself and Devin hiding. As Cameron started to count, we scurried around trying to find the best hiding place. I found the downstairs bathroom to be the best place for me. It was easy enough for Cameron to find me, and I hid Devin close to me so that I could keep an eye on him. As I entered the bathroom, I closed the door quietly behind me. I walked a few steps into the room and was now facing the mirror. As I was looking at my reflection, I also noticed something behind me that was moving. It was the closet door directly behind me, slowly opening. The closet door opened halfway and then slowly closed again, all by itself. I had the same feeling come over me like I did when I was upstairs on my first day. Wide-eyed with fear, I turned to the bathroom door and ran out. All I could think was, what just happened? I was really starting to worry that this house was haunted, and I now had every horror movie that I had ever watched playing through my head. Now I'm finding that I'm really uncomfortable, but I decide it's best to keep occupied. I break out a board game for us to play on the living room floor. Hungry Hippo, I think it was. We were playing for around 20 minutes before I noticed something again out of the corner of my eye, moving. I turned my head to see what it was. A child's shoe was tumbling across the floor all by itself. The kids stopped and watched in confusion. I was in disbelief. Cameron let out a scream and she ran for the door. I grabbed up Devin and followed. We went to my friend's house next door and told her mom everything. I'm not sure if she believed me, but we stayed over there until the parents got home. When they showed up, we told them what we saw. I don't think they believed me either. I showed the panel that fell out. Apparently it's been an issue since they moved in, and as for the rest of my accounts, they chalked it up to an overly active imagination. I know what I saw and what I felt. I wasn't imagining anything. I later found out a bit of history on the house. Apparently, a man died in the house after a heart attack upstairs in a room above the dining room where the paneling kept falling out. I think that his spirit is still in that house, and that maybe he was just trying to play with us. I'm an atheist, not very superstitious, but my family are big believers and have always claimed that our house was haunted. So about 2 hours ago, I fell asleep in the guest bedroom. Everyone avoids that room, but I like the ambience, so I've been spending a lot of time in there lately. I should probably note that there's a mirror by the bed. So first, I thought my mom walked in, and I remember saying, "Get out!" I know I heard the door open. I just asked her if she went in, and she didn't even know that I was taking a nap. Then, as I was sleeping, I heard whispering and scratching sounds. I started remembering things that never happened, and I could envision a lady with black hair sitting on the couch in the room. I knew I needed to get the hell out of there, so I tried waking up. The dream was so vivid that I thought I did wake up. I looked around the room, and written in red everywhere was murder, death, etc. There were also red tally marks all over the walls. There was a doll on the floor, a life-sized cloth one, and that's when I knew I was still dreaming. Suddenly I look over to the couch, and there she is. It was the lady with black hair. I tried waking up, but at this point I was experiencing sleep paralysis and I couldn't open my eyes. Finally, I woke up for real and ran out of that room. I don't ever want to go back. Anyone have any ideas on what happened? Am I overreacting? Edit. Okay, I'm getting freaked out now. I just woke up, it's 5 a.m, to another dream. This time I was in a normal world and felt like I was being watched. I kept telling everyone, but they wouldn't believe me until I fell asleep in the dream. Something or someone pulled the blankets up and laid down next to me. I'm not joking. Someone please help. I don't know what's going on. I had a gut feeling that it was that thing again. I woke up and had to call my mom to come in. This is getting weird. For someone who doesn't believe in God, I want to call an exorcist. About 3 years ago, I went camping with my now ex-girlfriend. She had always expressed interest, but had never actually been. The spot we went to is in the Huron National Forest, and is my go-to trail camping spot, as it's hidden deep in the forest, and the access trail is close and easy to get to, for ATVs, etc. My family has been going to this spot for about 6 years, and my friends that introduced me about 10 or so years. We went for a weekend trip, and I'm glad we didn't go any longer. When we got there, everything was going well, except we did notice a group of people that were hanging out next to our campsite, but they were just stargazing, and soon they left. Then around midnight is when the weird stuff started to happen. At first it sounded like someone was laughing at us, but the laugh never ended, and got very high-pitched as it just kept going. After a while, we both got kind of scared and went into the tent to try and sleep, and that's when the laughter/noise moved up higher, and then started to circle the campsite. After a while of that happening, it just suddenly stopped, and then started again around 3 a.m. When it started again, the fire was going out, so I went to stoke it with my shotgun in hand, and turned on my flashlight to see if maybe I could see any coyotes or something around the campsite, but I didn't see anything or hear any movement. This went on until 6 a.m. and then stopped, and then finally we were able to get some rest. After we woke up, we checked around the camp and didn't see anything out of the ordinary, so we packed up. Once we were packed up and good to go, I tried to start my vehicle, and it was completely dead. That really freaked me out, as I'm always paranoid about leaving things plugged in that kill the battery and make sure that everything was closed. Yet somehow, the battery still died. I was able to get a jump from AAA. After that happened, I told my friend, who had shown me the campsite and also has a cabin in the same forest, roughly 25 miles away from that particular campsite, about what happened, and he got freaked out. He told me about 2 incidents, one at the campsite and one at his cabin. At the campsite, he stated that one night after we had all returned from trail riding and went to bed, he stayed up to hang out by the fire and have a few drinks. While he was hanging out, he was just looking off into the distance and saw a pair of eyes up in the trees looking directly at him. He described them as being bioluminescent. He flashed his high-powered flashlight at them, but there was nothing there, and as soon as the flashlight turned off, there they were again, looking right back at him. So he packed up and went right to bed. He didn't tell us because he didn't want to scare us. At the cabin, he was hanging out with his brother, and they were both just chilling by the fire outside, when again they saw a pair of eyes looking at them from a trail that leads into the woods. They stated that at the height the eyes were looking at them from, whatever it was, had to be 7 foot plus tall. They started shooting at it with their rifles, and the eyes disappeared, but once they were gone, they reappeared and were closer. At that point, they were both freaked out and got back into the cabin and did not leave until daylight. We have no idea what this could have been, but all felt very scared when these events were happening. After we talked about it, one of the brothers thinks it's a Wendigo. I don't really know what that could be, but I haven't been that terrified since. I was living with my parents in Mexico City. They were missionaries preaching the gospel. When I was 7, we were living in a small town. One day my mom woke me up around 3 or 4 in the morning. She brought me to the window and said, "I wanted to show you why we are here and why we do what we do." She picked me up and showed me a strange woman standing in our front yard doing some ritual or something. She had something on her face and hands that looked exactly like the Elephant Man, like the bark of a tree. She had candles lit and the whole setup. This woman lives in this village, and she knows who we are and what we're doing here. Our being here interrupts her way of life and the energy that she taps into, my mom told me. I'm showing you this because I want you to know what kind of things we fight against. This isn't just preaching the Bible to people and trying to make their lives better. This is a battle against a world of darkness, and you are a part of it. My parents knew this was serious, but weren't really that worried about it because they could just pray it off and nothing ever happened. I bet that made the woman even more angry. On that day, I realized that witches are real and not just a fairy tale, especially since she had stuff growing on her. Demons really do give some sort of power to people. That day was not only a crazy experience, but the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. We moved 2 years later because I wanted to be a normal American kid that goes to school and has friends and stuff. A few years after we left, a family that we knew and had worked with died from a truck driver not seeing them on a cliff. I can't help but wonder if that was just a freak accident or something more. The whole thing creeps me out. When I was around 12 years old, my family and I moved into a semi-detached house just up the street from our previous home. The house wasn't very big, and the floor plans for our part of the house were completely different from our neighbors. Our neighbors were a lovely little family of 4. Husband is from England, wife from Norway, which is where I live. They also had a 3-year-old little girl and a 6-month-old baby boy. Now, I love children, always have, and at that time, I really wanted to start babysitting. It's quite common to start babysitting at age 12, and I was turning 13 a month later anyway, so I wanted to find some small job. As we got to know our neighbors over the next few months of living there, my parents told the neighbors that if they ever needed a sitter, then it would be nice if they would consider trying me out. Seeing as it would be my first job as a babysitter, we thought it would be smart to start with my next-door neighbors, seeing as my parents would literally be on the other side of the wall just in case anything happened. Cut to a Friday night when my neighbors went to a party that was happening just down the street. I got there at around 8 p.m., and the parents told me that they would come home at around 2 to 3 a.m. Both kids were already sleeping, so they told me to just put on a movie and relax. These kids were the easiest to babysit ever. Once you put them to bed and they fell asleep, absolutely nothing would wake them up. They are some of the heaviest sleepers I've ever seen, so babysitting them was usually pretty uneventful. I was on the couch watching Avatar in the living room on the second floor. The kids had their own separate bedrooms that were just downstairs where the front door was. I could basically see their bedrooms from where I was sitting, as the place was quite small. Because of the hallway, I couldn't see the front door. Again, this house was very small, so as long as the TV wasn't on too loud, then I could hear everything that happened downstairs. At around midnight, I heard the front door unlock, and my neighbors walked in while talking. I heard them close the door, and I heard them start taking off their jackets and their shoes. I thought it was a bit weird that they hadn't called to let me know that they were coming home early, but I just assumed that it must have slipped their minds, so I went downstairs to greet them. I could hear them talking up until the point that I came around the corner to the hallway that led to the door. There was no one there. The talking fell silent the second that I turned the corner. The only sound was from the TV upstairs. My heart started beating so fast and my head was rushing. I ran to the bedrooms and checked the kids before I searched the rest of the house. I opened every door, checked every cabinet for anything that would explain what had just happened, but there was nothing there. The kids were still sound asleep. Eventually, I convinced myself that I was just imagining things. I checked the kids one last time and made certain that the doors were wide open so that I could see them from upstairs. I sat down to finish the movie whilst trying to process what had just taken place. But when I sat down, I noticed that the TV had been shut off, even though I had left it on. When I turned it back on, there was just snow on the screen. I couldn't for the life of me get it to work again. That's when the talking downstairs started up all over. Not only that, but the baby started screaming bloody murder. This baby never woke up from naps, and definitely wouldn't ever scream the way that it did that night. I have never in my life run down a staircase as fast as I did then. I rushed toward the baby's bedroom, only to find the door closed. I ripped it open, picked the baby up, and rushed to pick up his sister. I took them both upstairs and held those kids for almost 3 hours before the parents came back home. The talking and sounds downstairs came and went as I had the kids with me on the couch. I held them as close to me as I could and tried my best to help them stay asleep. As the parents came home, I was too scared to walk downstairs to greet them. I couldn't be sure if it was even actually them or not until they walked up the stairs where they found me clutching their children. Obviously, they noticed that I was upset and asked me what had happened. I honestly felt like I had lost my mind at that point, but I told them the story anyway. After I was finished, they told me that it wasn't the first time anything like that had happened there. Apparently, they heard voices all the time at night. I was kind of mortified that they didn't think to warn me before, but they said that they were sorry that this had happened to me, and the mom walked me home to my house. I slept with the lights on for almost a month after that. Believe it or not, I did go back and babysit those kids again. So for some backstory, my mother has breast cancer, and before our town got a cancer treatment center at the hospital, my mother would have to travel to a city 4 hours away to get treatment. At times, this would be 3 days. She would leave, get treated, and then come back on the third day. At this time, my brother was in his early teens and was going through that rebellious stage of his life. So guess who gets called to look after him when my mother does her treatments? Day 1. My mother leaves early, about 6 in the morning, and tells me that she would send me a text message once she gets to her hotel. I came around yesterday so that my mother could leave early and told her to have a safe trip. Eventually, my brother wakes up to get ready for school. This is on a Friday. I give him his lunch, and he's off. I spend my day just sitting around my mother's house, giving her cat some attention, giving the dog some food, watching TV. The basics, really. Sure enough, my brother returns back from school, and we do the typical brother things. Night comes, he goes to bed, and I stay up for a little while, watching TV. About 10, I turn it off and make my way to the spare room where I was staying while Mom was away. I get underneath the blanket and close my eyes. As I could feel myself on the verge of sleep, I hear it. Thud, 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 thud. It was the sound of footsteps, as though someone was quickly moving back and forth through the living room. My eyes shot open, and my thoughts quickly went to burglar. Someone was in my mother's house, moving around, trying to find something to steal. But as I listened, I noticed something else. I would hear it, then a pause, and then again, like someone was running back and forth, only stopping for a moment just to do it all over. The sound was too light for a grown person, but sounded more like that of a child. I sighed, believing this to be my brother. My mom had told me before she left about how my brother would sneak out of his room to grab his phone or Game Boy and play it when he was meant to be sleeping. Thinking this was the case, I get out of bed and make my way into the living room. As I did, the noise stopped. I continued on up to my brother's room. I opened the door and peeked in. He looked like he was sleeping, but looks can be deceiving. I returned to the living room, and I decided to pretend to have fallen asleep on the couch so that I could catch my brother in action. Somehow, I actually did fall asleep. I awoke to something brushing my nose. Turns out it was the dog. I look around to see the slightest of light coming in the windows. If I had to guess, it was maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. Tired, I get up and make my way back to bed. Once again, as I felt myself about to drift off, the noises started up again. In my tired state, I just concluded that it must be possums in the roof, and went back to sleep. Day 2. It was Saturday, so I let my brother sleep in. The lazy butthole didn't get up until 11. It went well. We hung out, had lunch, played some games, nothing really major. Well, not until that night. Once again, I stayed up while my brother went to bed, and again, around 10, I turned the TV off and went to go to sleep. Sure enough, just as I was about to drift off, thud, 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 thud. Those darn possums, I moaned to myself. Then I heard a little girl giggle. My eyes shot open after hearing that, and the running resumed. I sat up, hearing the playful running back and forth in the living room. I just sat there trying to figure out where this little girl's giggle had come from. It sounded like a 7 or a 10-year-old. I turned to the window, seeing the next-door neighbor's light still on. I began to think that the noise I was hearing was coming from them, that maybe they had a little girl over and she was just being a pest. It was a good possibility, except for one thing. The couple who lived there were old and didn't have any grandkids. I heard that giggle again, much clearer now, like it was just in the living room, which was just outside my door. Needless to say, I didn't sleep well that night. Day 3. That morning I was uneasy, but was glad that my mother was returning. About 1 p.m. she got back home, and I began to pack up to return home myself. But the events of the past 2 nights still stuck with me as I returned back to her. Getting the courage, I asked her if she had ever heard a little girl in that house. "Oh, her?" my mother states. "Yeah, she's quite a mischievous one, isn't she?" I just smiled and left. I spent other nights there looking after my brother, but never heard from her again, and when my mother moved to another house with another ghost, I felt like she traded one for another. But that's a different story. My strange experiences started 4 years ago when I was in my room trying to sleep. It was 2 a.m. and I was bored out of my mind. I had a projector that showed me the time. Important. The anti-burglar alarm was on. My family was asleep. I sleep in a room next to the hallway door which leads to a living room. I heard the door open and the projector stopped working. It started working when I blinked. The day after that, it was around 2 a.m. again. I noticed something heavy sitting on me. It went away after a while. I had my head covered by my sheets, so I couldn't see what it was. Those days I saw shadow people out of the corner of my eyes. The worst one was when I was in the shower. I looked in front of me, and something pink just sped up in front of me in the air and vanished right into a wall. The happenings just went away after that, for a while. In the summer of 2017, I was sitting on my bed after lunch. I noticed the air around me felt thick and heavy, and I said, "Something bad will happen." It was August 17th, 2017. The day of the Barcelona terrorist attack. It was around 1500 hours when I said it. For some reason, those 2 hours until it happened felt like seconds. 2019. I'm back from my trip to Norway. I was taking a photo of a book that I had bought there when I saw a black orb while I was aiming at the book. I thought it was a sock. The ball vanished when I took the photo. A bit before going on my trip, I had been practicing soft combat with a few friends when part of the cardboard shovel I was hitting a friend with just vanished. No one else noticed. I had some more experiences with vanishing headphones and chargers, but nothing else. My most recent experience started a month ago, the day when high schools in Spain had to close because of the coronavirus. I was on my way home, and I had the bright idea of reading a prayer in a dark magic book that I own. A prayer against evil spirits. Bad idea. I own a few Solomonic books, and one of them warned against using black magic because the effect would be reversed. Since that day, strange things have happened to me. No shadow people, but what looks like shadow rabbits hopping into my walls. I see them out of the corner of my eye. I also saw a silver one. A huge crow vanishing into a tree. I mean huge, the size of a bike. A black iron bar floating near my window and then vanishing into a tree. I've also spotted what I think was a UFO. And they get weirder. 2 days ago, I was doing some work in my room and I saw a pair of shoes outside my window moving at a great speed. It was not my family. They were in the kitchen, quite far away. I checked again. No shoes. And just yesterday, my family heard me laughing in my room when I was working on something important and not laughing at all. I've been reading a book called Other Side Picnic about urban legends lately, so maybe it's affecting me? Another strange thing was the knocking on my window a few months ago. I heard it in my room and in the room where my parents sleep. It woke me up, but they didn't notice. It couldn't have been the wind. It was a calm day. It couldn't have been branches, as the trees are very far away. The dream I just had was one of the most prophetic that I have ever had. I have gotten into the habit of listening to historical documentaries while I sleep, and one of them just made its way into my dream. Let me explain. I was sitting on a bed in a broken-down old house when I started hearing an animal screaming in pain outside. I run to the window, and I see an older man, and who I can only assume is his wife outside this house, with a strongly malnourished panther that is on the ground in front of them. The older man has a whip, and is raising it up before I yell to stop, and the panther jumps up, climbs up the side of the wall to my window, and the large jungle cat climbs inside. I start to close the window, and the man starts to scream to give me his animal back to him. I only flip him the bird, and then turn to help the animal. I leave to go get some meat and a bed and whatever else I think the animal might need when I get back. It's nighttime. I walk back in, and I see the panther laying with his head on my pillow, asleep. I turn around to put the stuff down and close the door, and when I turn back, he's sitting up, staring at me. I apologize to him for waking him up, and I show him the meat. I tell him that I don't want him chewing on me next time he gets hungry, and he says, "I couldn't." At this point, I'm completely caught off guard, and I just stare at him. He continued, "You saved me. I would never eat you. My name is Ramses." I smile at him and introduce myself while placing the meat in front of him. As he finishes up, he looks up at me and says, "Thank you. I wish I could be here on happier terms, but I have a message about this world and all of its humans. This world will have to face judgment in an endless desert. So much was given, and so much was ruined. Now there will be nothing. I'm sorry." I let him know that I understood, and I thank him for his message. Suddenly, the house around me begins to shake and crumble. Just before a large piece of wall falls on me, I wake up. This happened 30 years ago when I was about 13, 14 years old, and me and an older friend were babysitting for a 6-year-old girl and her younger brother. We have been told that sometimes the girl complains about seeing a ghost man in her bedroom and upstairs at night, and that he comes out through the attic door. Now, I didn't believe a word of it. Kids are weird and say weird things. We get the kids ready for bed, but they wouldn't settle. The girl said that she felt scared, and her little brother started crying. She asked if she could sleep in her mom's bed until she got home. The little brother wanted to go with her. So I tucked them in and told some silly stories and laughed until they were both tired. Both kids were virtually asleep when we left, door ajar, hall light on. An hour later, we're sitting downstairs watching The Equalizer, and all was good. Kids were definitely asleep, as I had to sneak past their room to use the bathroom. I had a quick peek on my way back, and aside from the little brother snoring a bit, everything else was quiet. I go back downstairs, and we watch TV a bit more. About 20 minutes go by, and out of nowhere we hear banging. Heavy, heavy banging, and the kids are screaming immediately. I run up the stairs, and meet the kids as they're running out of the room. More banging, and this time I have eyes on the kids, so I know that they're not making the noise. The kids fly at me. I grab the little brother, and we rush downstairs into the front room, shut the door, and all crash onto the sofa. Everything is silent apart from the TV, which I switch off. We sit in silence for about 5 minutes, just sorta holding each other. After a bit, the girl, with tears in her eyes, just says in a matter-of-fact way, the man was angry because she wasn't in her own room, so he tried to push over a wardrobe, and then he started thumping the wall. This event has stayed with me all these years. This happened 2 years ago, August 11th of 2018. And since the anniversary just passed, I thought I would finally share this story. My fiancé and I were on the second night of our 2-night camping trip at a popular campground about half an hour from where we live. For reference, my fiancé is black. We live in a predominantly white, conservative, and racist area. This is important later. On our first night, we kept hearing noises in the woods around us. The campsite right beside ours to the right was occupied, but the one to the left was not. The campsites are about 150 yards apart, and we had camped here in the exact same plot the year before. Needless to say, we were familiar with the area and the various kinds of animals that live in the woods. The first night, we heard shuffling around our tent. It was obviously something large moving around. We brushed it off and assumed it was just a deer. Now, back to the main event. On August 11th, we spent the day at the battlefields a town over with my family. They had all been invited to join us for the day by my fiancé as a surprise for me while he proposed to me. We stayed with my family into the evening, about 6 p.m., before heading back to our camp. When we got back, things were really odd. Someone had obviously been inside of our tent. Our blankets were thrown around, clothes were on the ground, and my backpack had been rearranged and I was missing underwear. But hey, we were stupid 19-year-old kids and decided that since whoever had busted in had left and hadn't taken anything important, that it was fine and they wouldn't come back. So we set up a campfire and set out until it was dark, roasting hot dogs and s'mores, smoking cigarettes, and celebrating our engagement. Around 9:30 p.m. we put out our fire and decided to go into our tent for the night to celebrate a little more. Nothing too loud or obnoxious. Immediately after we finished, we started to hear the noises outside of our tent again, but this time we focused in. We heard clear footsteps and at one point, a man whispering. We looked at each other and our eyes got wide. Someone was definitely walking around right outside. We were still and completely silent, just listening to the footsteps, and we heard whispering again. Make that 2 men walking around our tent. As if we had telepathic abilities, my fiancé said, "I have to go to the bathroom," and I agreed. The bathroom was up the hill from our site. Most people who were in lower sites like ours drove their cars up to the bathroom. Now here is the part that I still get chills to think about. We got up and were getting dressed. My fiancé had just turned on the light in our tent when a man spoke directly to us from right outside. "What are you doing?" he asked. I can't even describe how malicious and menacing this voice sounded. It was clearly directed at us, and he said it with a snicker. He was watching us through the walls of the tent. Allow me to reiterate that we were stupid 19-year-old kids, so we decided to just make a run for it to the car. My fiancé grabbed his pocket knife and his keys and stepped outside. He pulled me with him and we ran like hell. I heard the footsteps running behind us, and then turning and running up to another campsite. At the bathroom, we talked over our options. We debated sleeping in the car or driving into the town. Then we had another idea. We drove back down to our campsite and began packing everything into the car. At this point, it was around midnight. We moved faster than I think either of us thought possible, wrapping up the tent with our belongings still in it and grabbing our folding chairs. We were all packed up in 5 minutes and hopped into the car to leave. I jumped out at the end of the drive to grab our nameplate, which had my full name on it, off of the post. As we pulled out of the campsite, I saw our assailants for the first time. Stalking through the woods onto our campsite were 2 tall, white men. I realized that these were the same men who had been driving past our campsite the whole time we were there, just glaring at us and muttering to each other. One was wearing camo hunting gear, and the other one was wearing a Confederate flag tank top. Both were carrying large hunting knives, unsheathed and at the ready. They turned when they saw our car driving away, and one started to make chase until the other one stopped him. I made eye contact with the man in camo, and he smiled the most terrifyingly evil smile at me and shook his head slowly. We drove the long way home, taking all the weirdest, hardest-to-follow roads, and called my dad so that he would know we were coming. When we got there, we told my dad everything, and he shrugged it off as us just being paranoid. So I never told anyone else besides all of you just now. I am convinced to this day that that was going to be a racially motivated attack. The campground was not heavily populated, and my fiancé was the only non-white person at any of the campsites. It was no accident that the two men who had been shadowing us since our arrival and wore Confederate flags and had one on their truck decided to target the interracial couple. I still get cold chills when I think about how close we were to being killed or seriously hurt that night, and just how lucky we were that our reckless plan to just make a run for it actually worked. So to those men who stalked our campsite with the hunting knives, let's not meet again. Ten years ago, when I was about 16, I started babysitting for a family that lived in my neighborhood. They had a sweet 7-month-old baby girl that I would babysit every now and then, and 2 dogs that were also very nice. Despite them having a nice house in a nice neighborhood, I still got a very weird feeling when I was in their home. It was almost like I was being watched or felt a presence there. Whenever I took care of the baby or their dogs, I would never want to spend longer there than needed. One night while babysitting her, about 2 years old, she asked to go down to their basement to play with Play-Doh. I said yes, and we went downstairs. I got a very weird feeling when we went down there, but I still got out the Play-Doh for her. We were playing for about 2 minutes before she came over to me and said that she was scared. I asked why she was scared, and she said that the man was scaring her. I said, "What?" Because I thought that I had heard her wrong the first time, and she said very clearly, "The man is scaring me." She then asked to go upstairs, and I said yes, and she bolted and ran up the stairs and left me to clean up the Play-Doh. About 6 months after that, the family asked me to care for the dogs while they were out of town, and I said yes. I ended up burning some sage and asking the spirit to leave the space. After that, I didn't feel the presence as strongly. It was to this day such a weird experience, and I still have no explanation for why that all happened. This happened about 13 years ago. I'm currently 28, and my childhood dog died in early high school for me. This wasn't too long after. Upon looking up what this is, it was most likely a false awakening, but still gives me chills to this day. I shared a room with my older brother, who was a pretty heavy sleeper once he got there. He'd usually be up playing video games all night, and I got used to being able to fall asleep through the sounds of him yelling at COD players for using noob tubes and all that good stuff. One night I woke up feeling the foot of my bed sink in like someone was down there. When I looked, I noticed a small child sitting with his back toward me. The child seemed to be wearing a black shirt with white horizontal stripes. I immediately thought to myself, "Alright, fuck that," and went back to sleep. I woke up what felt like a few hours later, and he was now standing at the foot of my bed, facing me, holding my dead dog's head. in his hands. The child was surrounded by an extremely dark aura, so much so that I didn't gather any details on skin complexion or anything. I immediately lost my shit and freaked out, falling out of my bed. This part creeped me out because the fall was very detailed. I knocked over an acoustic guitar that I had on a stand near my bed when I fell out, and my brother shuffled in his sleep due to the noise. When I tried to wake him up, he mumbled, half asleep, that we needed to get more Pepsi, not an encounter with him that would surprise me at all, and went back to sleep. I then scrambled back into my bed, all while this kid was just watching me, holding my dog's head throughout. I fell back asleep, and then had my real awakening that morning. The guitar was in its stand, and everything was normal. I ended up not telling anybody about this dream. The really fucked up part, and why this particularly bad dream still gives me chills, has to do with the fact that my dog was buried in my backyard, in a little side yard that always had some really weird energy to it. Months later, my friends and I were hanging out, and we usually smoke weed in my backyard close to this side yard area. We had made our way inside and were munching and watching movies when my good friend Joe said that he needed to run to the backyard and get his phone. He went out to get it with his usual demeanor, but I heard his footsteps running full sprint back to the back door into the house. His skin was pale, and he was visibly shaken up. I asked him what was wrong. His response, "Dude, you're going to think I'm crazy, but I just saw a little kid standing where your dog is buried." I grew up in South Texas, more widely known as the Rio Grande Valley. I'm the youngest of 3 kids, and we all lived with our mom and stepdad in a great big red brick house. It was quite a culture shock moving from the piney woods of East Texas all the way to the flat, desert-like land of the RGV. There were hardly any trees, mostly just palm trees and shrubs. We saw a cactus here and there, and the wildlife consisted mostly of jackrabbits, rattlesnakes, and armadillos. When we started school, we learned quickly that the people were superstitious, to say the least. I was in the 2nd grade when we moved into that house on Jackie Street, and right from the beginning I felt uneasy. I used to be a happy-go-lucky kid with nothing to worry about. I made friends with all the neighborhood kids, and I even became best friends with a girl who lived directly behind us. She had the most superstitious family out of anyone that I had ever met. She was the oldest of 4 girls, and their mother was very overly protective, at least in my eyes. She wouldn't let them watch Harry Potter because it was associated with witchcraft. They went to church 3 times a week, and they didn't even celebrate Halloween. All that being said, the mom loved to tell ghost stories and Mexican folklore. It was the one cool thing about her, and the thing I loved most about visiting their home. One night, she told us the story of the Owl Witch. Typically, it will transform into an owl with a woman's head, or a large owl the size of a human, with a few things that are off-putting. If you see a Yakuza, you're supposed to pray for your life in Spanish, and supposedly it will leave you alone. It's also been known to make a whistling sound, like a human whistling. If you answer it back with a whistle of your own, the Yakuza will sweep down and carry you away. If you wake up in the morning and see large scratches on your doors or windowsills, it means that the Yakuza was there and is coming for you, so you must prepare yourself accordingly. I can't whistle, and my friend's mom knew this, so she would jokingly tell me that I wouldn't have anything to worry about. She would also lovingly tell us that my friend and I are gorditas, so we couldn't be carried away as easily. After years of hearing this story in various ways from teachers, other friends' parents, and in books, it was about as stuck in my head as an old wives' tale. I would get excited about hearing it around Halloween at school. It was just another scary story, and would give us kids an adrenaline rush. I never thought that those stories would one day become a reality for me. It happened the summer of 5th grade. My best friend and I were on her trampoline. It was summer, so we were up kind of late, maybe around 10 p.m., and it was a full moon. We spent time talking and looking at the stars until we heard whistling. We knew not to whistle back. Instead, we lay there frozen, still looking at the sky and listening intently to the whistling coming from the distance. I look at my friend, and she is absolutely paralyzed. She's praying in Spanish and squeezing my hand as tightly as possible. A few minutes go by, and we hear more whistling, getting closer. My friend stops praying and says that we should head inside. I agree without hesitation, and we start inching toward the edge of the trampoline to escape. In that moment, I hear it, and I'll never forget the bone-rattling sound and the twisted image that scarred me for life. We felt the wind from its wings, and saw it just maybe 15 feet above our heads. A huge, snowy white owl, maybe 12 feet wide from wingtip to wingtip, floating right above us. Its eyes were jet black, and it looked mostly like an owl, but its feet were human. It had huge, human feet with long black talons that seemed to twitch as its cold, demonic eyes stared down at its prey. It locked eyes with me and let out a screech. My heart jumped into my throat, and I have never ran inside a house so quickly. We cried together while praying, as we heard it continue to flap around outside. We held on to each other with her rosary in our hands, and continued praying as loudly as we could. All of a sudden it was gone, onto its next victim. We're both terrified of owls to this day. We won't even look them up in books. Every time I see one, I think of the face of the Yakuza. Almost human and almost owl. A strange, demonic hybrid not of this world. Believe the tales. Don't go outside alone, and never respond to strange whistling. Something might just snatch you up and carry you far, far away. I was babysitting one night for a family friend about 4 years ago. I had put the kids to bed and crashed on the couch while waiting for my mom and the friend to get back from a night out. Randomly, I woke up and just remember being very confused about why I was even awake. That was, until I heard the front door close. A key thing to note here is the fact that the only sound was the door closing. There was no sound of it being locked, and this lock was very loud. I assumed it was my mom and her friend coming back, so I sat up, preparing to leave. However, I quickly noticed the lack of their voices. They are never quiet after a night out, especially because the friend always has some drinks. And I also noticed that there was only one set of footsteps. For a moment, I considered the possibility of it being the friend's husband coming home to grab something. He is a firefighter and was at the station for one of his 24-hour shifts. I could hear the person walking around the front room and then going to the table in there and shuffling through papers as if frantically searching for something. The more I listened, though, the more it just didn't feel right. I pretty quickly dropped the idea of it being the husband and jumped to the idea that it was an intruder. Being around 15 at the time, I was in no way brave enough to confront any intruder that broke into the house. I barely managed to scoot along a wall leading to the front room before becoming completely paralyzed by fear. I ended up promising myself that I would keep my presence hidden until the person walked upstairs to the kids or back toward me. I could hear them pacing around a lot, papers and items being shuffled through. Eventually, I heard the footsteps start to come down the hall before turning into the bathroom, which was before they could reach me or the stairs. Only seconds after the footsteps walked into the bathroom, I heard the front door unlock. This ties back to the beginning because it really stuck out that the door was never locked, and I can remember every single sound from the second that I woke up. Immediately, I heard my mom and the friend talking loudly, and part of me was relieved, while the other part of me was prepared to hear them screaming upon finding an intruder in the bathroom that was too small to hide in. Shockingly, they just walked straight past it, and my mom told me to get my stuff so that we could go home. I was still listening the entire time, and the bathroom door never closed and no further footsteps were heard. As I finally walked down the hall to the door, I scanned the bathroom. The door was wide open, the window was shut and too small to fit anyone but kids through, and there was nobody crouched in the darkness. There was absolutely nothing off about the house. No windows open in any of the first floor, and nobody left between my mom coming back and us leaving. Nothing. I'm a skeptic. I like to think that this may have been an intruder, but I cannot think of any logical way that they could have hid in the short minute that it took for me to walk by, nor did they have an escape route. The friend never found an intruder or noticed any missing items. Nothing makes sense. All I know is that night is vividly ingrained in my mind, too vividly to be a dream, and I still get that feeling of something not being right when I think about it. I was about 17 when this happened. I moved in with my father after living with my mom for most of my life. Behind his house is a trail in between our house and the neighbor's house. It's pretty unbeaten, but you can still find your way through it. At the end of the trail, there's a very small pond. The first time I walked back there, I found it very charming, until I turned my head to see a small porcelain sculpture of a boy sitting on a log. The paint had faded from years of sitting there. The shirt was still slightly colored, but the thing about the paint that bothered me most was his eyes. They looked so blank. But the most important detail to the story is the hands, or the lack thereof. His hands were nowhere to be seen. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a forgotten decoration put there by the neighbor long before I had arrived. The pond behind my house afterwards is where I would go and smoke weed while my dad was home. The sculpture never bothered me too much. That is, until the day that I touched it whilst I was walking around. I walked to the very back of the pond and further into the woods and found a small, wooden, decrepit shack. I wasn't about to waltz in there and get shanked by a weirdo, so I left it as is. But I got a really sinister feeling from it when I turned my back to it. When I was making the return trip, I had to slightly lean on the sculpture as to not fall into the pond. When I say I've never felt something so sickening and evil, I mean it. I immediately let go and sat back in the small chair that I had set up and began to smoke, thinking I'm just being paranoid. Then, as I finished my bowl, I feel something tug my hoodie slightly, so I jerked my head to see. Nothing there, and I just brushed it off as a branch or something, so I took a deep breath, leaned back in my chair, and looked up at the stars, leaving my arm dangling down off of the chair. Then I felt a small, cold hand wrap its fingers around my index finger. I nearly shit myself, jumped up, and sprinted back to my house, leaving all my paraphernalia at the pond. Keep in mind, it's about 9 or 10-ish, so I'm tripping over branches and vines until I found myself back on my back porch. From there, I could hear several twigs snapping and footsteps crunching pine straw heading back toward the pond. I haven't been back since, and I'm not planning on going. Between that old shed and the small, handless sculpture, the whole area gives off bad energy that thankfully I don't think I've brought into my house. My mom and I were camping in our kind of local national park in the Alps. I had a headache and had slept rough that night, but nothing special other than that. My mom, who I thought had slept well, apparently really did not. The next morning, she told me about dreams that she had, and that they were incredibly realistic, that they had kind of scared her. She thought she had heard men talking outside of our tent in a foreign language, and thought that we were about to be in trouble, being that we were two women alone in the middle of nowhere. Then she saw a woman walk slowly just next to our tent while looking at us. She was wearing this sort of farm outfit. Next, she saw a whole lot of people dressed in white, in trenches, just there. I will add that this national park is also the site of a World War battleground. Sometime after, she was just looking at where we were on Google Maps and saw that there was a single flashing dot on the exact spot where we had slept. Then, looking for it again, it was gone. I didn't feel or see anything particular that night, and never would have thought that my mom was having such bad dreams. We thought that what I had was sleep paralysis, with the visual hallucinations and all. But now that we talked about it again, this feels more like an encounter than a simple sleep paralysis episode. We're both okay. We're just wondering at the weirdness of it all. I live in Eastern Europe. Well, more specifically in Romania. You may have heard stories about those gypsies and witches that live in my country. Most of them are just pretending to be something that they're not. This is the story of a real witch. My grandmother used to live in the same village with a witch. I don't know if the witch was a gypsy or Romanian, but it doesn't really matter. She lived for so many years that no one actually knew her age. This woman claimed to be a witch, and she also claimed that she had this demon who served her. She used to talk about the way that she sold her soul one night in the forest while performing a ritual. In return, she gained powers and the help of a demon. She said that she couldn't die until she convinced someone to take full charge and responsibility of her duty as a witch and sell his or her soul to the darkness as well. She had, I believe, 3 daughters, but people said that their mother's behavior scared them away. They moved to Bucharest and never returned to the village. Now, you'll say that she was most likely a crazy old woman, but no. A lot of people heard strange noises coming from her attic, and she agreed that the sounds were made by her slave or demon. People, even though they were afraid, asked her to solve their problems and gave her money for it. No one ever complained about her work. No one. Everything was put in place, no matter how difficult the task was. Also, people witnessed a lot of hard work getting done overnight in her yard and garden. Stuff that she wasn't able to do alone. Unfortunately, I don't know if she's still alive. I have one more story about a witch. My grandmother met a woman on her way to work. This woman asked my grandmother about the witch. She wanted to know where the witch lived. My grandma gave indications, and then asked her why she was going. She said that a thief broke into her house and stole all of her savings. She wanted her money back. The next day, my grandma met the woman again. She carried a bag. My grandmother asked her what happened. She said she went to the witch and received the promise that she was able to find the money on the table when she returned home. The witch asked in advance for half of that money. The woman agreed. It was better than nothing. Things happened exactly as the witch had said, and she carried the promised money in the bag on the way to the witch's house. One more story is that a woman fell in love with a married man. She went to the witch and told her that she wanted that man. The witch asked her if she wanted the man no matter what the consequences were, and she said yes. In less than a month, his wife fell ill and died. He remarried. He got married to the woman who had indirectly killed his wife. That's why she was seen as a powerful witch. As a real witch. She had some supernatural powers. This happened a couple of weeks ago, and I'm still in disbelief. Little background, I work second shift and get off late at night, where cops are on the hunt for drunk drivers. Quite literally, like the title says, I was driving home from work when I pulled up to a red light. With me at the light was a police officer, nothing too out of the ordinary, but after the light turned and they sped off, I maintained a decent tail on the cop, never taking my eyes off of them. With me at the light was a police officer, nothing too out of the ordinary, but after the light turned and they sped off, I maintained a decent tail on them, never taking my eyes off the car. I cannot stress the fact that that isn't an over-exaggeration, because I for sure did not stop looking at the cop car. Eventually I caught up to the car and boom, it was just a normal car. I never saw another car join us on the road. Nobody passed me, and nobody left the road. The cop car didn't turn off, and I didn't lose sight of the car. I obviously wasn't under the influence of anything save caffeine, which I'm accustomed to. It's honestly freaking me out, still. I've been a babysitter a bunch of times. Sometimes I take care of the kids of my mom's friends, other times I take care of my little cousins. I really liked to babysit all of my kids, because it usually went smoothly and none of them were problematic to deal with. One time I was babysitting my little cousins, who at the time were 6, 4, 2, and 5 months old. My aunt told me that the baby monitor needed new batteries, so I decided to just check on the baby from time to time. The night went as usual. The bigger kids ate dinner, played a bit, then watched some cartoons, and fell asleep a few minutes after. I was downstairs just texting with some friends and tried to listen carefully in case my baby cousin made any sounds. For most of the night, I thought I heard the baby making sounds, so I kept going in there and checking on him. I believed it was just my mind playing tricks on me, probably because I was on high alert, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, the 2-year-old woke up crying because of a nightmare, so I grabbed him and let him lay on my chest until he fell asleep, and then I tucked him into bed again. A few minutes passed, and I heard the baby screaming, so I ran upstairs and did what I could to calm him down so that the other kids wouldn't wake up. As soon as I get to the door, the screaming stops, and when I entered the bedroom to check on him, he was sound asleep. I freaked out and checked everything in the nursery, hoping to find some kind of toy with a similar sound, but there was nothing. I immediately went and checked on the other kids, praying that they were okay. Fortunately, all 4 kids were asleep, and it appeared to have not disturbed anyone. Still, I made sure everything was all right, and that nothing had actually made a sound. I was kind of surprised that the scream hadn't woken any of the other kids up, but at the same time I was thankful for it, because I didn't want the other kids to be scared in their own house, and also I wouldn't know how to explain what had happened to my aunt and uncle without freaking them out. I didn't hear any other sounds for the rest of the night, until my aunt and uncle came home. I decided to not say anything, and just take the money and go home. Since I was 18 or so, I've been having dreams where I know it's a dream, but I cannot wake up. Once, I dreamed that I was sleeping in my bed at my parents' house, and suddenly I woke up in the dream, and everything was normal. TV on, door slightly open. But there was a weird feeling in the room, which I ignored. I tried to get back to sleep, but my conscience told me to turn my head to the door, which I did. It was slightly open again, but this time it was opening a little more every second that passed, and a dark presence was on the other side of the room. At this point, I freaked out, jumped out of my bed, and tried to get out of the room, but something was holding me back, and the path from my bed to the door seemed eternal. Suddenly, everything stopped, and I woke up again in the same position I dreamed of first, TV on, door slightly open. I was still dreaming, and the same thing happened again. Door slowly opening, and me trying to run away from the room through a never-ending path from my bed to the door, with a weird feeling of someone watching me all along. This was a cycle that happened a number of times, that I can't remember, but it was more than 4. I knew I was dreaming, but could not wake up. I was really scared. I tried to wake me up by yelling or hitting me in the dream. Nothing worked. I remember that in real life I was not in my parents' house, and therefore I was not in that bed. At that moment, when I remembered that, I woke up. I dreamed something like that a couple of weeks ago where I couldn't wake up even though I knew I was dreaming. I have no idea why this happens. My family has a camping timeshare, and we used to go there for weeks at a time in the summer. My dad had to work, so he would stay at home Monday through Thursday and come and meet us at the campgrounds Friday through Sunday. The campgrounds had a pool, a miniature golf course, basketball courts, and we'd gone for so long that my mom was comfortable letting us wander since there was only one entrance and exit. When I was around 8, but was fairly small for my age, so I looked around 5, I met a little boy who was camping with his single dad for a few days. He came to our campsite a lot, and knew we were staying for a while. I was pretty sad when he left, but his dad said they'd come back sometime soon. A few weeks later, his dad came back to the campsite right after my mom left to take a shower. He told me his son was coming later that week. He asked where my parents were, and I told him my dad doesn't come until Friday, and that my mom always takes a shower at this time. He said bye, and then left. The next day, he came by at the same time and told me that he had just found some kittens and asked if I wanted one. I said yes. He told me he kept them in his tent and that I could come pick one out. Now, this guy wasn't a stranger. My mom had met him when we picked his son up from our campsite, so I didn't get that creepy stranger vibe and was okay going with him. We walked towards his campsite, but then he told me he had actually moved them to his truck so they wouldn't get too hot, which made sense to me at the time. He pointed to his truck right outside the gates of the entrance. I started walking toward the entrance with the guy when my dad pulls up. He got the day off work so he could spend more time with us. He asks what's going on, and I say, Tommy's dad said he has kittens in his truck and I can have one. My dad gets out of the car, tells me to run back to the campsite, so I do. When my dad gets back, he tells me to never go alone with an adult anywhere, even if I know them. I asked my mom years later about the whole thing, and she told me my dad kicked the crap out of him and called the cops. This happened about 2 weeks ago while my brother and his wife were at a party. My own wife and I get called to babysit my nephews and nieces for these sorts of moments by all of my siblings. In this instance, when we were asked to babysit my 5-year-old nephew, his 3-year-old sister, and his 6-month-old brother, we happily obliged. They live in a newish, 10-year-old house, and the only significant location near it is an important cultural site for the local Cree peoples about 10 kilometers away. The hard work was done for us, as the 5- and 3-year-old were asleep upstairs before we arrived. The baby was not fussy but would not sleep, so we were hanging out with him on the main floor. As the night dragged on, around 10:30 I heard a baby crying upstairs. Thinking the 3-year-old must have woken, I left the happy baby with my wife and went to check on our niece. My wife heard the crying as well and asked me to go check. On my way up the flights of stairs, I definitely heard crying from that floor, and I pushed my head into the kids' room to listen. The crying was still going on, but both kids were sound asleep. The sound was coming from across the hall, the nursery, so being quite confused, I moved toward that room. The crying ceased about midway between the door and the crib. Seeing the room was empty, I immediately began trying to explain it to myself. I picked up the baby monitor unit in the room to make sure that it wasn't picking up an errant signal from another house. It was not on, and didn't have a speaker anyways. There were no toys that made that noise around, and no TVs or devices that might play those noises in the room. I stuck around to listen a while longer, but nothing came of it. My wife was baffled and a little spooked, as she had clearly heard the crying as well. Nothing happened the rest of that night, and my nephew is still just the same wonderful kid that he has always been, so I guess no harm, no foul, spooky ghost. My brother and his wife went white when I told them about it at Christmas, but to my knowledge, it is the only thing like that that has ever happened in their house. His house has no history and had also been smudged, so no advice is necessary from anyone. I just thought y'all might appreciate a wholesome, unexplained experience. This story happened in the early 1930s. He, my great-grandfather, was living in India, which was still under British rule. As he was from a poor family, having a motor vehicle was not even an option for him. He used to travel to nearby places by horseback. One day he went to meet his friend, and it got a little late by the time he was coming home. It was around evening. He decided to take a shortcut through the jungle instead of using the road, which takes almost double the time. On the way he saw a little goat just abandoned sitting beside a tree. He thought it might have lost its way, so he decided to bring it along with him and leave it somewhere out of the jungle. He dismounted, picked it up, and put it at the back of the horse. Just when he was about to get back in the saddle, he noticed something odd. The horns and feet of the goat were facing the opposite direction. Quickly, under fear, he pushed the goat down and climbed up the horse to make a run out of the jungle. He started chanting a prayer to his guru. He was sick. Just as the horse started moving, he heard a female voice from behind. "Your prayer saved you today, but I don't know how you'll get away next time." As he turned back, he saw a woman standing there instead of the goat, just staring at him, her eyes wide open. This is a true story, so it creeps me out even though jungles like those don't exist in the modern world. This incident was really scary. I was riding my bike down a long road with almost zero vehicles on it. I was in the dedicated bike lane, scooting along as I'd done hundreds of times before down this stretch of road. There's about 3 feet of opening gap between the curb of this road and the bike lane, followed by a 3-foot wide bike lane, and then finally the vehicle lane. Vehicles are not allowed to park in the gap or bike lane unless they're the city maintenance vehicle crews. Vehicles are not allowed to park in the gap or the bike lane unless they're the city maintenance crews that service the road, grass, and noise walls of this particular stretch. Well, this day there was a big blue moving truck parked right on the curb, wide enough to take up the empty 3-foot gap and the 3-foot wide bike lane and spill over into the vehicle lane. I thought, no big deal, as there weren't any cars behind me and I had plenty of space to move into the road to go around it. The spot where the truck was stopped was the only spot on the stretch of road where the shrubbery from the other side of the noise wall was growing into the ground and out the other side. It sticks out like a sore thumb. But anyway, as I was going around the truck and into the vehicle lane, the door to the cab of the truck flew open forcefully right as I was about to pass it. I'm talking like the person that threw it open was trying their best to hurt me and waited for the best opportunity. At the last second, I clenched my teeth, swerved out of the way, and just instinctively swerved back into the bike lane and came to a stop. Angry and full of adrenaline, I screamed at them what was their problem, that they could have killed me, while dismounting my bike and making my way to the truck. This is where it got strange. There was no one inside the truck itself. I went back toward it, and there was no one outside of the truck either. It was really just there, with the door still wide open. There was nowhere anyone could have slipped away to. The noise walls are there to spare the neighboring homes from car noises, and they're about 10 feet tall, and they stretch out for a good quarter mile, with no open gaps anywhere. I went around to the back of the truck, and it was open and empty. Nothing in it, no hiding spots. Just an empty truck and an empty cab. I decided to just jump on my bike and go home. I pushed it out of my head and considered myself lucky to be unharmed. That lasted about a day. I can't help but feel like I was in some moment in time that somehow got stuck. Upon remembering the occurrence, there was almost no sound. No other cars driving by, no birds chirping, no wind blowing on what was actually a fairly windy day. It wasn't until I got closer to my home that everything felt normal again, and I was able to move past it. Now it plagues me that I didn't take a photo with my phone or didn't look for one of those "How's my driving" stickers to report the truck. It's one of those glitches that I'm just gonna have to wonder about forever. When I was around 5, I went camping with my parents in a place called Bear Creek Reservoir. Because it's a very isolated place deep in the woods, we got there by driving up an old logging road. The actual reservoir itself was very beautiful and quiet. I actually looked up the area on Google Maps, and it still gives me the chills, even looking at it from a satellite perspective, but anyways. So the day passed by without incident. We mostly just swam the whole day away, and then went to bed. But the following morning I woke up in my parents' tent, just as the sun was making its appearance. I unzipped the tent, and noticed a figure, standing maybe 50 feet away. The light was still fairly dim, so it was hard to make out distinct details, but the thing was just standing there staring at me, unmoving. The entity had the figure of a woman of average size, but instead of seeing a face, there was just darkness. But I could just sense that it was indeed looking at me. And instead of clothes and skin, it had leaves and sticks, as if it were made from them. I remember feeling very afraid of this creature, like if I had left the tent, I wouldn't have been seen again kind of fear. So I tried waking up my parents, and they were both really pissed that I woke them up that early and didn't believe me at all until they finally got up later and explored the area. We ended up finding a bunch of man-made structures, branches, and other weird stuff in the surrounding area. I am a serious skeptic with decades of debunking behind me, but I have a few cases that cannot be covered by SP, sleep disorders, infrasound, carbon monoxide, etc. One personal account occurred a few years ago after my paternal grandfather died, though this was before I dealt with his estate. I was spending a week repairing the old maternal family Bible, a damp, damaged 17th century Welsh edition, so a tough bit of work, and I went to the living room for a break. On the exact spot I was born, old family, old house, was a fixed pillar of smoke. I was a pipe smoker at the time, so recognized it by color and character, and opened all the windows to clear this mysterious miasma. It didn't move at all, and had a distinct Tonkin bean scent. I couldn't name it at the time. The exact same one that filled the hospital room during final prayers for my paternal grandfather. I'm an ex-Methodist preacher, so that fell to me. The pillar was seen and photographed by 2 others. 3 weeks later, I handled the estate, opened a sealed room, and found a Tonkin-based pipe tobacco tin. I spent 12 years ruling out any way that I could have known that scent, and there was no other way or means that I could know it other than spirits held me at that moment that a life ended and supported me to catalog family history. Simple and odd, but interesting. In the fall of 2019, I started babysitting for a new family. They live in a house built in the 1920s. I've always believed in angels and demons, not necessarily just ghosts. One of the first times that I was babysitting the 3-year-old and the 1-year-old, I was putting them to bed and I thought that I heard someone knocking on their front door downstairs. I looked out the window to see if the parents were home, but there was no one there. I decided to just ignore it. Another time, again, I was putting them to bed and I heard what sounded like a man and a woman having a conversation in the kitchen. Again, I looked to see if the parents had just gotten home. They hadn't. Another time, I was watching them during the day when the mom was out of town and the dad was at work. I expected him home around 3:30. The girls were napping upstairs, and I heard the kitchen door open and footsteps. I was surprised the dad was back so early. As I turned the corner to go and greet him in the kitchen, I saw what I thought was him, black suit and all, walk past the door frame. I entered the kitchen and started to say, "Didn't expect you back so early." But there was no one there. The last time I ever babysat them, I was playing in the backyard with the girls. Let me remind you that the oldest one is 3. She is constantly scared to be alone or in the dark, which I thought was strange because usually at such a young age, kids haven't had any experiences to make them this frightened. She said to me that day, "I saw Slender Man in my bathroom mirror, and he waved back at me." I was terrified. I asked her to repeat what she had just said multiple times. Slender Man. She is 3. There's no reason for her to already know what that means. At that moment, I realized that I had always closed her bathroom door just because it felt creepy. And when I would come back to the room later, the door was always opened. I've never babysat for them again. When I was about 5 years old, I used to have these scary, recurring dreams that always had the same old woman in them. The old woman had gray, curly, short hair, and she was always wearing a creepy black dress with lace on the hems. In the dreams, she would always be trying to scare me. It seemed as though she took pleasure in scaring me. A prominent one that I remember is her sitting on top of me whilst I slept, with a basket of flowers. She would just stare right at me. So only about 3 or 4 years ago, when I was about 16 or 17, that same exact woman appeared in my dream. Same scary vibe and everything. What is super creepy about this occurrence is that I hadn't thought about this woman or talked about her for so many years. It was totally random for that to happen to me. Plus, this recent dream was just as vivid as the others. Almost as though she was visiting me again through her own free will. Another thing that might not have anything to do with the dream is that when I was a child I had a black dress just like hers that would hang in my closet, and I didn't know where it came from. It always creeped me out because it looked like the scary old woman's dress. I can't remember where I got it, but I might have worn it to my grandmother's funeral, who died when I was 2 or 3. This is a short story. I was maybe 4 or 5 at the time. It was November or October. I'm assuming it was October because that day my dad and I had bought pumpkins for us to carve for the first time, according to my memory. Before we began carving, my uncle and I were in the backyard. My sister and one of my cousins were playing in a pile of leaves beside me next to a tall green pine tree, and my uncle went inside to grab a frisbee for us to catch, and a camera to take a picture of us playing in the leaves. I remember when my uncle went inside, I turned around to look at the beautiful trees. There was another apartment complex behind our own. I remember the sun had started to set, and the golden rays had coated the green, freshly cut grass on the ground. I also noticed a young woman in a white gown in the yard across from me. She was bent over, and she was putting a flower into the jacket pocket on a little boy who was holding a white pillow. My uncle came outside, and I asked him, "What is that lady doing?" He smiled and said no one was there. He called over my sister and my cousin and snapped a pic of us. I instantly forgot about the lady in the white dress. Years had passed, and I had grown into a young woman. I had moved in with my boyfriend, and as time passed, it came time for us to move out of our apartment. As I was packing, I noticed a box that my dad had given to me when I met my boyfriend. I didn't open it until that time. It was pictures of my family, old clothes I used to wear when I was a little girl. I opened a photo album and looked through it. Then I looked more in the box, and I found a photo, the one my uncle took of me that day when I was a little girl. In the background, within the golden setting sunlight, I saw a woman in a bride's dress. I saw her features and her outline in the sunlight, but only in the sunlight. She looked happy, and she was bent down with both of her hands together holding something. The rest of her body didn't show up. I took the photo with me and visited my uncle, and as we sat down I pulled out the photo and looked at it for a second. I wondered if he would even remember. I then mustered the courage to ask him if he recalled that day. He faintly did, and I showed him the photo, and he smiled, remembering the days when we were all just little innocent kids. I pointed at the sunlight and asked, "Do you see it too?" He looked closer and said, "The woman?" I said, "Yeah. Do you remember when I was a kid and I asked you about the woman in the white dress, and you said that no one was there?" He replied, "Oh yeah, I see it. It must be a ghost." Anyway, that was my little short story. This happened earlier last week at my sister's house. She lives about 5 minutes from me and has a 1-year-old baby girl who, when she goes to sleep, has a baby monitor in her room to make sure that everything is okay. Anyway, my sister had just finished putting my niece to sleep, and I was watching her on the baby monitor. Nothing crazy, and it was during the middle of the week around 7:30 p.m. Well, my sister comes downstairs and we make some small talk while I'm on my phone. Then I randomly decide to check the baby monitor, where there is a clear view of a rocking chair in place about 3 feet away from the crib. I saw myself sitting there, wearing a t-shirt and shorts, looking down at my phone in the rocking chair. I was absolutely horrified, and I screamed to my sister about it, and it scared the crap out of her. I had never seen anything like it in my life, and I didn't know how to react. When I looked up and she came rushing over to check the monitor, I was gone. Nothing. Just my niece sleeping in her crib in the dark. The rocking chair, totally empty. Obviously, we had to go and check on her, and I was terrified, and my sister had a bat, but no one was there but her. Nothing was out of place. I wasn't wearing what I had on that night, though. I was clearly wearing a white t-shirt and gym shorts with Nikes on. I had my glasses on, and you could see the bright cell phone screen in the dark as I hunched over to look at it. I never looked at the camera, but could tell that it was me, and I have not been able to sleep much since then. I can't get that picture out of my head, and the baby monitor doesn't record video, or else I would have gone back and looked. It's probably the craziest thing to ever happen to me in my life. I was not high, or drunk, or anything like that. It was a normal weekday after work. I had a strange babysitting experience the other night. Everything was normal until the kids were in bed, and so I was just scrolling through random vids on Instagram to pass the time. I was watching one, and I heard something. It was as if a man or one of the boys pretending to have a deep voice was upstairs said "no" or something in a weirdly growly voice. I was confused and a little spooked, so I brushed it off and sat on the couch to watch a movie. Their dog was walking around and growling at the windows that led to the backyard. That creeped me out too, but again I just brushed it off as the dog seeing a squirrel or something. At this point it's around 10 p.m. He then was laying on my lap and started growling and barking toward the kitchen. At this point I was like, come on man, you better cut that out. Because who on earth wouldn't be creeped out by that? Later, I heard these incredibly light, whispery voices like children. I wasn't completely sure if it was just the kids waking up and making noise, but it only lasted for a moment after I noticed. I noticed those weird things, but I really didn't put them together until later that night. I talked to my mom after, and she told me that my sister and her friend had babysat there as well, and they both had an odd experience, i.e. bad vibes, the kids telling her that she's seen some things, and the kids actually addressing something that wasn't there. My mom didn't tell me before so that I wouldn't be spooked, which I guess was good because I got an independent witness of whatever happened without being influenced by other people's experiences. But anyways, that's what took place. I'll still go back and babysit. I'll just be prepared to throw hands with Casper. When I was about 10 years old, I lived in a really small town. My friends and I would often play on the trails near the forest after school or on the weekends, building forts, fishing, etc. One day we were walking on a trail and a lady in her mid-50s or 60s came out of the woods. She had dirt all over her hands and pants. She said that her car broke down and that she needed help. We said that we would go get our parents to come help, but she insisted that we come into the woods. We said no, and kept walking, and she just stared at us. It was like she had just shut off as a person when we told her no. The smile went away, everything. Even when we were a couple of kilometers down the road, we could still see her staring at us. Anyways, we get back to my friend's house, and they're playing tag or something in his backyard. And we're playing tag or something like that in his backyard. One of us starts making fun of the lady that we saw earlier, and out of nowhere, he is launched into his parents' shed. It breaks the window on him, and his arm. We all stood there in shock. His parents came out and started yelling at us, blaming us and saying that we threw him. All of us ended up getting grounded. To this day, we all seem to have the same reoccurring dream of seeing the woman in the woods, except every time I dream it, she is closer and closer to us. This happened when I was young, around 7 to 8 years old. I was napping in my room that I shared with my younger brothers. Our bedroom consisted of only 3 mattresses put on top of 2-inch wooden panels and a child-sized wardrobe. There was also a floor-to-ceiling window that was strictly for decoration and couldn't be opened. When I woke up from my nap, my babysitter, she was a live-in, was folding our clothes. I talked to her for a while, and then went out to get a water. I don't remember what, but I needed to talk to her after, so I went in again. But she wasn't there. I remember thinking that it was weird. There had been no sound of any closing or opening of doors in the 5 minutes when I had left the room to go get the water. I proceeded to ask every person in the house if they had seen her. None of them did. So I went inside the room for a second time, thinking maybe she somehow was just hiding for some reason. But I still couldn't find her. I went out again and searched the house, before eventually going back to the bedroom for a 3rd time, and there she was, sitting in the bed, folding clothes like nothing had happened. I asked her where did she go. She replied, and I quote, "What are you talking about? I was here the whole time. I was shouting at you and asking you why you kept going in and out of the room, but you didn't answer me." She thought that I was pulling a prank on her, and I got reprimanded. There are still a couple of other incidents that happened around her, and to this day, I can't explain it at all. I had a dream last night that I was being shown a series of gorillas in cages. In the dream, my brother told me that they had developed new technology to allow me to feel the touch of their hands through the cages. Sort of like the suits in Ready Player One. Weird dream logic. Anyway, I'm being dragged through the enclosure and one of the gorillas strokes my head, neck, and back. The thing is, I could actually feel this sensation in my body. I have never, ever felt anything palpably in a dream. My reaction to the sensation was a deep-set revulsion. The creepy thing is that it felt like there was a creature surveying my sleeping body, stroking it like a piece of meat to play with, while imbuing my dreams with an excuse as to why it was happening. Stranger still was that when I opened my eyes after the dream, I could feel this huge hand cupped over my mouth. I felt completely powerless to the creature. It was as though it had little, tangible intelligence, but I could feel its feral nature enjoying the moment. It felt like something had lain down behind me in bed. Every time I opened my eyes, I could feel its massive hand over my mouth. Chalk it up to the mind playing tricks, or whatever. It was creepy and intimidating. When this happened, I was 9 years old, and camping out with 3 families other than my own. I was sleeping in a small tent with one of my closest friends when something woke me up. I listened and heard nothing from outside at first, so I opened the tent zipper enough to see the fire. It was out, so I knew the adults must have been asleep. I closed the zipper back and laid back down. Shortly afterward, I heard a high-pitched voice from outside the tent telling me to, quote-unquote, come out and play. I would have thought it was a person, but it was repeating itself over and over again, and moving close to the tent and then far away, all the time circling. I opened the tent and looked out, but it was pitch black. At this point, I tried to wake the friend, but he pushed me off. I tried again, more violently this time, and he woke up. I told him I heard something outside, but he must not have been fully awake because he just mumbled something and went back to sleep. I tried to go back to sleep myself, but the voice kept me up. I don't know when exactly, but somehow I finally did drift back off. The next morning, I told my friend who had been in the tent about it, and he said he remembered being annoyed that I woke him up. So to me, that means that I wasn't dreaming. I'm certain that I was fully awake, so there's no way that I hallucinated what I was hearing.